Footsteps in the desert. Footsteps that changed the world. 2,000 years ago, an itinerant Jewish preacher set out. In the Holy Land, he preached renewal and love. He would be killed, but his message would survive. The story of Christianity, an endless procession of humanity. A road through the centuries full of error and confusion, full of devotion and passion. Not made of historical dates, but rather lived by human beings. A story of suffering, but also a story of joy. An arduous quest for truth, 2,000 years long. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the Church faced its toughest acid test. The papacy had distorted the message of Jesus. That was the accusation of the critics, who demanded a return to the true belief. One of them was Jan Hus, the 15th century reformer. He had to pay for his ideas with his life. On July 6, 1415, he ended up as a heretic on a stake in Constance. He was to have presented his theses criticizing the church at a council. He had been guaranteed safe conduct, but soon after his arrival, he was thrown in prison. The Czech reformer died an agonizing death. The last words of Jan Hus, whose name means goose in Czech, have become legend. "You'll roast a goose today," they said he called out, "but a swan will come along to sing you a louder ditty." 100 years later, a study in Wittenberg. The Augustinian monk Martin Luther wrote a paper with 95 theses. In them, he summarized his personal ideas on the role of the church and turning his wrath especially against the sale of penance, the indulgences. That evening, Luther would post his theses on Wittenberg's palace church, so tradition tells us. The end of the 15th century, a world in upheaval. From Christian Europe, seafarers set out to discover new continents beyond the horizon. Among them was a dauntless sea captain from Genoa who ventured into the unending expanse of the Atlantic with 3 Spanish ships. Christopher Columbus discovered America. Despite all the sensational discoveries, everyday life still continued to focus on old concepts and customs. The medieval order was determined by Pope and Emperor. Luther's theses hit the public like an incendiary bomb. They took issue with the current indulgence practice, the commerce of penance, and they attacked the authority of the Pope. The indulgence. The option of buying oneself out of punishment for sins was common practice in those days. The fear of hell and purgatory drove the people to extremes. The quest for salvation, this was the ground on which the wildest confusions flourished. Witch hunts and the belief in devils. It all made it easy for the church to turn a good profit. It was the afternoon of July 2nd, 1505, that would radically change the life of the young law student Luther. While walking from his birthplace of Eisleben to Erfurt, he was surprised by a thunderstorm. He was almost struck down by lightning. Gripped by panic, he begged St. Anne, "If you help me, I shall become a monk." The experience with the closeness of death so shattered Luther that he turned his back on his former life. In the Augustinian monastery in Erfurt, he promised to serve God from that moment on. In an irony of history, Luther pledged his oath to the order of all places, right next to the tombstone under which Johannes Zacharias lay buried, one of the men who had brought Jan Hus to the stake. Luther became a compulsively dutiful monk who followed the rule of the order to the letter. If anyone had ever gone to heaven by living a monastic life, he later said of himself, then that is the way I wanted to go there back then. The life of the Augustinian hermits was hard and full of deprivation. 52 monks slept in a single room. No heat, no blankets, sparse food, constant penitence exercises. Laughing was prohibited. The average life expectancy was 30 years. A portrait of Luther from that period, a hard, ascetic face. Despite all his acts of penitence, Luther was constantly troubled with the fear of not finding salvation. He prayed unremittingly. He fasted for weeks on end, plagued by doubt. Luther went through a profound crisis which drove him into the confessional several times a day. "I was the most wretched creature on earth. Day and night I was racked by vain weeping and doubting." In November of 1510, Luther was sent to Rome on business for the order, in hopes of getting the self-torturing monk's mind on other matters. He would need 5 months for the arduous hike from Erfurt to Rome and back. A travel guide like this one also showed Luther the way to the Christian sites in Rome. 7 churches had to be visited. Those were the stipulations for pilgrims. Rome, the capital of Catholicism, seat of the Pope, hub of art and culture. But for the monk from the German provinces, it was also a shock. Everywhere, people were relieving pilgrims of their money. The holy places were being marketed. Years later, Luther would remember this experience with disgust. "If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I would never have believed that the papacy could be such a monstrous abomination." The Pope's lavish lifestyle seemed to have gone sky high. The new St. Peter's Church was under construction, architecturally a new wonder of the world, yet in the eyes of the Augustinian monk it was nothing but vanity. The small town of Wittenberg on the Elbe, the diametric opposite of Rome. Here Luther assumed a professorship in Bible studies at the newly founded university. Dr. Martinus Luther, theological scholar, an insignificant monk whom Rome took no notice of. Certainly nobody that year could have imagined that an impulse would go forth from here that would unhinge the entire Christian world. Luther's discovery contained a revolutionary realization. Salvation can be achieved by faith in God's grace alone, not by any deeds an individual might perform. With Christ's sacrificial death on the cross, God offered man the hand of reconciliation. God is not punishing or vengeful, but merciful and gracious. A divine image like the one Luther found in the epistles of the Apostle Paul, one that contradicted the practice of indulgences. The people who believe in Jesus Christ have been accepted by God, Luther believed. Not because they purchased their place in heaven with deeds, but alone because of their belief in the crucified. Sola fide, by faith alone is man justified before God, Luther proclaimed from the pulpit. Luther stormed at the purchase of exoneration from penitence, which is mentioned nowhere in the ancient Christian texts. A bought and paid for indulgence was nothing but a deceitful fraud and the work of the devil, he wrote. And even worse, he suspected where all that indulgence money was landing. This knowledge proved a real eye-opener. At first, I had no idea who was benefiting from these indulgences. Then the truth became known. No less a personage than Bishop Albrecht was behind it, because he had arranged to be elected Archbishop in Mainz, which costs 30,000 Rhenish guilders, for that is the high price the Holy Father can place on the thread of flax. In his need, Albrecht has invented the indulgence to repay his debts from the purse of the common man. On top of that, the Pope has kept his hand in the game as well, so that half the money can flow into the construction of St. Peter's Church in Rome. It was primarily the simple people, the artisans and farmers, who were financing all the splendor for the church. There were indulgences available for anything, even for the punishment of sins committed by people long dead. Toss the coins in the coffer with a merry cling, and the soul in purgatory will heavenward spring. That was how the people saw the message of the Dominican priest Tetzel, the supreme money gatherer in the commerce of guilt and atonement. The clinking coins flowed primarily into the mammoth project over which the young Luther had shaken his head: the construction of the new St. Peter's Church in Rome. One indulgence certificate after another, the papacy used them to finance the Renaissance, and they were the main factor threatening its continuation, because they became the trigger of the Reformation. It was a technical development at the beginning of the 16th century that first made it possible to spread the ideas of Reformation: printing. Without this black art, the protests of Luther and his supporters would never have gone beyond the Wittenberg town limits. Letters joined together to form thoughts, revolutionary ideas, spiritual explosives, which could be duplicated and distributed throughout the Christian West. Printed matter carried the message of the Reformation to the whole world. Woodcuts illustrated the texts, caricaturing the opponents, the papacy, and its cardinals. This mass media propaganda had been invented, and the monopoly on knowledge no longer lay exclusively in the hands of the educated individuals who knew Latin and Greek. The Pope is a full-bosomed jackass, as the monster of Rome. No slur was so drastic it couldn't be carved in wood. Abusive brochures and caricatures, Luther's opponents didn't hold back either. The theological dispute was conducted with the very latest means. On the freedom of a Christian person, Luther called his short fundamental work, published in 1520. Its very first sentence was a source of encouragement to his supporters. A Christian person is a free ruler over all things and subject to no one. The Pope demanded that the rebellious monk be turned over to him at once, but the Saxon ruler, Elector Frederick the Wise, refused. Legend has it that a monk had appeared to the elector in a dream sent by God. He had written with a gigantic quill so large that it reached all the way to Rome and hit against the Pope's crown until it got shaky. The theses from Wittenberg had set the stone rolling and ultimately released an avalanche. Luther himself is said to have been horrified by the echo his theses had caused. Actually, all he wanted to do was spark a dispute among theologians, but now it had turned into a flash fire. The whole song was getting too high for my voice, he later confessed about his anxiety. A political situation came to Luther's aid. The papal trial against him was not continued because the emperor had died. Yet even before Maximilian could be borne in pomp and ceremony to his tomb in the court church at Innsbruck, a conflict over his successor flared up. High-level politics has other problems than silencing a monk. Luther made good use of the time he gained. He preached and taught. Scholars from all over Europe arrived in Wittenberg, brought the reform impulse to Scandinavia, the Netherlands, England, and Switzerland. Starting in 1522, Zwingli advanced the cause of the Reformation in Zurich. On Lake Geneva, it was John Calvin who radically reformed the city in the 30s of that century. Whether Geneva, Zurich, or Wittenberg, the Reformation always pursued the same goal: a reformed church in which nothing may contradict its basic mission, to proclaim the grace of God. But there were differences even among the reformers. Ulrich Zwingli disputed Luther's concept of Holy Communion. This dispute would split the reformers into two camps. Our Lord Jesus Christ, in the night he was betrayed, took bread, and after giving thanks, he brake it, giving it to his disciples and saying, "Take, eat, this is my body."
Nehmet hin und esset, das ist mein Leib, der für euch gegeben wird.
Holy Communion, the central ritual in the Christian religious service since the religion's origins, a remembrance of the last meal Jesus had together with his disciples. Wine and bread. Right from the beginning, they stood for the blood and body of Christ. But how is it conceivable that wine and bread are transformed into blood and body? Does a real transubstantiation come about through divine action, perhaps by a miracle? Or are the wine and bread simply signs, only a symbolic indication, mere remembrance? This was the controversial question for which the reformers had different answers. For Zwingli, the bread and wine were nothing more than a sign. Bread remains bread, wine remains wine. Luther, on the other hand, focused on the biblical words, "This is my body," Jesus had said. The body and blood of Christ are thus truly present in the sacrament. That was his belief.
Christi Blut für dich vergossen.
Holy Communion. This was God's transaction with man. And it was also a mystery beyond comprehension by mere reason. A divine mystery which is nevertheless revealed to the believer. Worms, 1521. In the Diet building right beside the cathedral, everything was at stake. This was where the destiny of Martin Luther and the Reformation was decided. The Diet, an impressive summit meeting of all the powerful sovereigns in the Holy Roman Empire of German nationality. 31 rulers, 50 bishops, 83 prelates, 145 counts, and the representatives of the imperial cities gathered here. A gigantic assembly of political power, all under the chairmanship of the new emperor Charles V, a sovereign who came from Spain and hardly spoke any German. For several months, the rulers discussed every issue related to the future of the empire, including one topic the emperor considered tangential. The monk Martin Luther, whom the Pope had declared a heretic, was to be silenced. Should he nevertheless be given an opportunity to defend his ideas here before the whole world? It was decided, let Luther appear. Charles V guaranteed Luther's free and safe conduct. But what good was an emperor's word anymore? Charles was only 21 years old, and he was only interested in preventing a church schism to assure the political unity of his realm. Luther faced a difficult decision. Hadn't the Czech reformer Jan Hus also been assured safe conduct and then burned at the stake in Constance? Luther's answer has become legend. Though there were as many devils in Worms as tiles on the roof, I will go there. The journey to Worms became a triumphal march, and posterity has made a hero of the monk who dared challenge the Pope and the Emperor. A creature of light, a people's tribune. The fearless trip to Worms embodied the hopes of many people. The peasants, the knights, and the rulers who were striving for political autonomy and freedom from the shackles of the church. Worms. Luther's opponents hoped for his recantation. The unity of church and realm were at stake. A terse reply ignited the powder keg. I can and will not recant anything. Here I stand and can do nothing else. Christianity's march through history. It had been Luther's intention to rediscover the original message of Christ. The Latin word reformare means to restore something to its original form. It described the claim of the reformers to be closer to Christian truth than the Catholic bishops with their dogmas and their finery. The Reform movement found adherents on all levels of society, and the impulse has continued to exert its influence right to modern times. The Reformation, however, also brought about the division of the Church. In the centuries to come, this conflict would claim thousands and thousands of lives. The fact that even pious intentions like the ones that motivated Martin Luther can lead to bloody wars is one of the most painful experiences in church history. One of the most tragic contradictions the faithful in every age have had to endure on their path through history. Worms is like a symbol of this contradiction. What happened here in April of 1521 aroused many hopes, but at the same time, fierce resistance. Posterity has stylized Luther's appearance before the Diet of Worms to a heroic act, and his Catholic opponents to dismal adversaries. What is the truth? As expected, the emperor had imposed an imperial ban on the rebellious monk, but he did keep his word. Luther was allowed to depart unmolested. The further story has come down to us in the chronicles in generous detail and reads like a mystery novel. On the late afternoon of May the 4th, a horde of highwaymen stopped Luther's coach. An ambush by hostile thugs eager to put Luther out of the way? A party of papal commandos? Imperial troops? Just the opposite. A rescue mission cleverly disguised as a kidnapping. On orders from the Saxon elector, Luther was taken out of circulation for his own protection. The public was alarmed. Ulrich von Hutten, the representative of the free nobles, publicly offered Luther his support should he still be alive. But nobody knew any specifics of Luther's situation, not even in the circles of the imperial nobility. Rumors made the rounds the secret Luther affair was perfectly organized. The Wartburg near Eisenach, a German landmark. It was here in the 13th century that the famous singing competition is supposed to have taken place. And this is where Luther was hidden behind thick walls, unrecognized even by the castle residents. He spent 10 months in this little chamber, camouflaged as Sir George, a time of difficult inner upheaval. While his writings were being burned in Mainz and Cologne, he was condemned to silence. While the tempest raged outside, he was isolated. He would later say he had been cast before 1,000 devils in this idle solitude. He ate, drank, and slept too much. Uneasy and driven, he wandered through the eternal sameness of the corridors of this desert, as he put it. The only outlet he could find was in writing, but this only put a small damper on his uneasiness. He grew a beard and exchanged his monastic garb for a knightly doublet. He began translating the Psalms into German and the New Testament. Working, sleeping, eating, walking up and down stairs, and the wine all afflicted him. Even more so, his worry about what was happening in Wittenberg and how it would all continue. Legend tells us the devil suddenly appeared to Luther on the wall of his chamber. Ink against the devil, against the Pope, the Antichrist. And from this ink grew the letters, words, sentences, books that were the weapons in the struggle for Christian truth. The New Testament Luther translated would make the original message of Christianity accessible. In a simple and clear German everyone could understand. Luther's Bible translation became one of the best sellers of the new book industry. The first 3,000 copies sold like hotcakes. Luther's style and articulation would leave more of a mark on the German language than any other book. Even in the remotest countries, the Luther Bible influenced Christian development, because this translation sent out an impulse which led to the Bible being translated into any number of local languages. Countless language versions of the Book of Books have been printed since then. The message of Christ has taken form in every alphabet of this world. The Word. It stood at the heart of the new faith. The word of the Bible, but also the words spoken from the pulpit, the sermon. And something else also found its way into the houses of worship, the church pew. Its purpose, to bring calm. The people should be able to concentrate on the words, on the sermons. The church, it was no longer a spiritual room, but also a lecture hall. Ritual took a back seat. The word began gaining in significance. And the lavish adornment of many churches fell away. A storm on images in southern Germany and Switzerland. The statues of the saints were shattered. The gleaming altars tossed out of the churches, adornment and images, idle decorations which merely distract from the Christian message. That was the opinion of the reformers. The Reformation developed a revolutionary explosiveness, especially in those places where there was social unrest. A wave of violence now rolled across Germany, the peasant uprisings. The tension between the poor peasants and the rich landowners turned bloody. Luther, having liberated himself from Pope and Emperor, had served as an example to the rebelling peasants. He, however, disassociated himself from the marauding hordes with drastic words. "Ye lords, beat the peasants to death like mad dogs wherever you can get your hands on them." The peasant uprising against higher authority never had a chance, even though 7,000 peasants had banded together in Thuringia. The many willing hands were only sparsely armed with sickles, flails, clubs, and axes. But they did find a Protestant leader, Thomas Münzer. His pamphlets called for rebellion. These fine gentlemen themselves, he wrote, have caused the poor man to oppose them. Münzer believed that divine power would support this just cause. He was certain the heavenly hosts would come to their aid and lead the peasants in their decisive battle against the nobility near Frankenhausen. 1,500 lordly knights and 1,000 foot soldiers, well equipped with rifles and cannons, drowned Thomas Münzer's rhapsodic dream in a sea of blood. No angelic intervention occurred. The peasant army was annihilated almost to the last man. Thomas Münzer was beheaded. Luther's tragic role in this massacre was clear to him. His words of regret have been passed down to us. "I, Martin Luther, have slain all the peasants in the insurrection, for I called for them to be beaten to death. All their blood is upon my head." Luther may have kept the Reformation from going under with the peasants, but at what price? He took a part of the Reformation's explosive power away from it. Faith in God in troubled times. Only 4 weeks after the devastating battle near Frankenhausen, Luther married, surprising friend and foe, while concurrently setting a sign: marriage for priests, adhering to a reform program. He, the monk, and his wife Katharina von Bora, a former nun. For Catholic tradition, a mortal sin. In the eyes of the Reformation, a parish house marriage with God's blessing. The marriage was happy and produced many children. Katharina organized the household, which never had fewer than 20 persons to look after. Children, relations, students, visitors. Guests from all over Europe came to the study in Wittenberg, in the former Augustinian monastery. The enthusiastic and profound conversations at the dinner table established a literary genre. Luther's home became a model for the Protestant parish house. Luther and Katharina von Bora, an example of a preacher's family for the coming centuries, for a joint effort in the service of the congregation, in which women assumed important tasks, and in which the parish house became the heart of community society. Luther, still despised, could continue his work unmolested under the protection of his ruler. An almost contemplative life, personal happiness. The anathema of the Pope and the Emperor's band seemed locked out of this idyllic family life. Outside, the Reformation spread and became more firmly established. Congregational rules were written. The first evangelical hymnal came out. Barely 10 years after the publication of the 95 Theses, 1/5 of the people in the empire confessed the Reformed faith. But the huge contest between Protestants and Catholics was yet to come. Even the reformers tried to defuse the conflict. The Confessio Augustana, the Protestant confession that was submitted to the emperor in 1530, did insist on reforms, but it also stressed common cause with the Catholics. But the chasm was too deep. Against threats from the emperor, the Protestant parties formed the Schmalkaldic League. The fronts started to firm up. Luther, too, no longer believed in reconciliation. He now marked all the writings that authentically came from his pen with his sign, the Luther Rose. The Luther Rose, the quality seal of the Reformation. Luther's name stands for a whole epoch. Until his death in 1546, he was better able than anyone else to bring his message safely through all the political storms. A skillful advocate of faith who was always able to rein in his religious fervor when straightforward dealing was called for. Dr. Martinus Luther did not die by the sword, or like Jan Hus on the stake, but rather peacefully in bed at the age of 62. And he was splendidly laid to rest in the palace church in Wittenberg. Even Emperor Charles paid his respects to the rebellious monk beyond his death. When he visited his tomb 1 year after Luther's death, he was advised to have the corpse incinerated as a belated punishment for the heretic. And to prevent the palace church in Wittenberg from becoming a shrine of the Reformation, Charles V refused. "I make war on the living, not on the dead," we are told he said. The War of the Religions. Luther did not live to see it. Thousands, however, would have to die for their faith that very same year. The Protestant League of Schmalkalden fused the military power of northern and central Germany. To combat it, a Catholic resistance formed in the south and west. The forces met in battle near the town of Mühlberg on the Elbe in 1547. April 24th, 1547. The news that Catholic troops had arrived under the leadership of the emperor surprised the Protestant defenders. They had withdrawn to the east bank of the Elbe and thought they were in safety. A mistake. The emperor had marched with 5,000 horsemen and 20,000 foot soldiers from Spain. The imperial army was fast and battle-hardened, a powerful striking force for times shaken by crisis. The river, however, prevented their immediate attack. But then the imperial troops found a ford. Additional boats accelerated the crossing of the Catholic forces. The Protestant troops under the Saxon elector Johann Friedrich went quickly on the defensive. The first victims of the huge religious struggle, thousands of soldiers died in the name of their Christian truth. The Protestant elector could only get a fraction of his 30,000 men into battle formation. Their situation was hopeless. The elector's scattered troops sought refuge in the nearby town. In vain. The imperial horsemen hunted down the remainder of the Protestant forces and forced them back into the river. The The battle was decided in the late afternoon. Elector Johann Friedrich was taken prisoner. To this day, a memorial slab reminds us of the capture of the Protestant leader. The end of the Reformation? Militarily, the Lutheran reform had been vanquished, but the expectations it aroused, the changes it brought about, remained. The spirit of the Reformation could no longer be driven out of the people's minds, not with arguments, and not at all by force of arms. Today, sunflowers grow on the former battlefield. In the beginning, there was one Christ, one message. Later, one mighty church in one Christian kingdom. But the march of Christianity kept splitting up. Bloody battles between Christian brothers. Painful reality for everyone who truly believed in the message of Christ, the message of love. Too often it was soldiers and power politics that decided the quest for Christian truth. The religious wars, they were tragedies which darkened the Christian horizon in the early modern age. Not until the Enlightenment would the skies again grow bright.